Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start the program. It is 12:01, and we're slowly, I'm seeing the numbers move up, so people are joining. I'm Ann Nickel with the United Nations Association of New York, and welcome to our program on multilingualism this afternoon. Multilingualism is of particular importance to the United Nations. By promoting tolerance, multilingualism ensures effective increased participation of all in the organization's work, as well as greater effectiveness, better outcomes, and more involvement. Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish are the 6 official languages of the UN. English and French are the working languages of the United Nations Secretariat and are used in day-to-day professional exchanges. Before we begin our program today, I wanted to just read an abridged version of the statement released by our national office, UNA USA, in regards to the nationwide protests that are going on in our country today. The United Nations Association of the United States of America extends their condolences to the family of George Floyd and all other victims of racial violence. As we advocate for human rights, we condemn those who deny those rights to any men and women, in this case to men and women and children based upon the color of their skin. The protests, demonstrations, and riots we now see in the streets of our nation are demands for justice and change. The cry once again is no justice, no peace. While we advocate for civic action, we know that violence begets violence. However, we also know, as Dr. King stated, that violence is the language of the unheard. And we know that the struggle for civil rights in America has continued into the 21st century. Let us not waver nor falter in our commitment to human rights for all. Let us not be bowed nor bent to inhumane ideologies. Let us not fear to uphold the higher laws of humanity. Let us reaffirm that the United Nations Association stands for human rights, that we stand for justice, and we stand for the future of humanity. I urge you to read the full and urgent statement from the Honorable Teta Banks, Chair of the National Council of UNA USA, which is posted on our website at unanyc.org. Thank you. Now we have with us this afternoon an eminent scholar and professor, Antonella Sorace. She is professor of developmental linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. She is a world-leading authority and has published widely in the field of bilingualism across the lifespan, where she brings together methods from linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science. She is also committed to bringing research to people in different sectors of society. She is the founding director of the Research and Information Center Bilingualism Matters, which currently has 27 branches in 3 different continents. So please welcome Professor Sorace.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I wish I could be there in person, but I'm delighted to be with you anyway. Let me tell you a little bit where I come from. I'm lucky to be working in Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh, which is one of the best places to study bilingualism and language learning over the lifespan. We have an excellent research group, and we study children who learn 2 languages together, 1 language first and then another, young adults who learn another language, and then older adults who also learn another language. Bilingualism is also very close to my heart because I'm originally Italian. I've been living in Edinburgh in Scotland for most of my life now, and I use English in my everyday life, in my professional life. So I'm going to tell you why bilingualism is important, why investing in languages is important. And in this respect, this is very, very connected to what Anne was saying earlier, because I'm going to say that all languages matter. All languages have a culture behind, and all languages are good for the brain. This is the main argument that I'm going to put forward. So we should really work together in such a way that all languages are protected, and bilingualism and multilingualism in all languages is appreciated and valued. So let's clarify what bilingualism and multilingualism is, because for many people, you're not bilingual unless you've learned 2 languages from birth and you know them perfectly. Now, this is not the way we use the term bilingual or multilingual. For us, a bilingual is a person who knows 2 or more languages and uses them on a regular basis, whether they are lucky enough to have learned 2 languages from birth, or whether they've learned 1 language first and then another language as children, or whether they've learned another language as a young adult or an older adult. So for us, all of these are cases of multilingualism and bilingualism. So bilingual means more than one. Now, we have a particular challenge in the so-called Anglosphere, so the English dominant world where I live and where you live too. So clearly there are countries, many countries, where English is either the national language or the native language of the majority of people. And so English is, of course, you know, the majority language. But also English is the most studied language. So out of the world 7 billion inhabitants, 1.5 billion speak English, and that's 20% of the Earth population. And there's about 360 million people who speak English as their first language. But also English is by far, because of these figures, by far the most commonly studied foreign language in the world. French is a distant second if you look at that table. So English is a prestigious language that everybody wants to learn. In many cases at the expense of other languages. And this is a point that I want to come back to. Now, in the UK, we have what I would call a situation of privileged monolingualism. So the UK has the worst language skills of all 28 countries in the EU. Now, the UK is not part of the EU anymore, as we know, but those figures still stand. And the lack of language skills has been calculated as a loss for the economy of about 48 billion of British pounds a year. So it's a huge tax in terms of the economic value. And the impended Brexit changes will probably make the situation even worse because they will build more language barriers. Now, in the US, the situation is not much better. So a survey done in recent years shows that there's about almost 21% of the population who speak a language other than English. But the language skills, so the vast majority of population in the United States speaks English only, as you can see from that graph. So this is the so-called Anglosphere. Now, what we're going to look at is, later in my presentation, is bilingualism in minority languages. So it's been calculated, and nobody knows the exact number of languages spoken worldwide. It's about between 5,000 and 7,000 languages spoken worldwide. There are 196 sovereign states, and that means that the vast majority of languages are indeed minority languages in every country in which they are spoken. And by minority languages, we can mean both regional or indigenous minority languages that are only spoken in certain areas by a small number of people, but we also mean immigrant languages, languages brought in by migration, so languages that might be spoken by many people in the countries where they are spoken, but they become minority languages in the country of migration. Now, I'm going to tell you why more than one language is better than just one, regardless of which language is. So the benefits of being bilingual. And it's interesting to notice that over the last 100 years, opinions about knowing more than one language, so bilingualism in the broad sense, as I said before, have changed from being overwhelmingly negative to being positive. So just to, two small quotes from very prestigious scientific journals. In 1926, this is a quote. So the use of foreign language in the home produces mental retardation. A quote from 1941, the simultaneous learning of two languages produces a mental obfuscation or tangling. So this gives you an idea of what people thought then, which is not terribly long ago. Now, the opinions have changed, but there are still very common misconceptions about bilingualism. One is confusion, for example. People think that a child who's exposed to more than one language, well, how can they learn to speak any language properly? Don't they become confused? Also connected to this, the idea that if a child comes from another language background, they have a problem at school. So how can they do well if in the language of schooling, which is usually the majority language spoken in the country? If they have another language, they can't do very well at school. And then the problem that we were mentioning before, that doesn't show on my screen, but I'm going to tell you anyway. There are prestigious and non-prestigious languages. So bilingualism is valued when it involves a prestigious language. So English, for example, as we said before, everybody wants their children to learn English because that opens doors, because it's perceived as a useful language. Chinese is gaining ground as a language that people want their children to learn because China is gaining political power and economic power on the international scene. But bilingualism in minority languages, as we said before, that's not really appreciated. That's what I wanted to show. Now, what makes a language useful? As we said before, instrumental, many people see the usefulness of a language in instrumental or practical or economic terms. And that's why, as you see, English is again the top of the list in the list of most instrumentally most useful languages. There is obviously cultural value. It's really quite difficult to move on. Yes, so social, cultural value of a language, because as I said before, there is a culture behind every language. And so a bilingual person is often a bicultural or a multicultural person. And I'll come back to the value of this. But what I'm going to show you in the next 10 minutes is the value of bilingualism from a linguistic and a cognitive or mental point of view, which is what many people don't usually know very much about. So let's start by saying that bilingualism changes the brain. Now, it changes the brain from an anatomical point of view. So if you study a language, even as an adult, there is a growth of extracortical matter in the brain. And this may surprise you, but it shouldn't be too surprising, as I'll say in a minute. There's also changes in the brain from a connectivity point of view. So if you speak more than one language, there is more connectivity in certain areas of the brain. Because there is more engagement of certain areas of the brain and more connections within the brain. Now, is this surprising? It shouldn't be too surprising, because bilingualism is not the only experience that has these effects on the brain. There was a very well-known study a few years ago about London taxi drivers. Now, London taxi drivers, there was a study on their brain that showed that London taxi drivers have more connectivity in areas of the brain that are responsible for spatial orientation. Now, if you are a taxi driver in a city like London, but also New York, any big city, you better have a very good sense of orientation. You develop a very good sense of spatial orientation by doing your job. And that is reflected in terms of more connectivity in the areas of the brain specialized for this. Musical experience is another area, another type of experience that has been found to have this kind of, bring this kind of changes in the brain. So bilingualism is not magic, it's not special, it's a type of experience that changes the brain. Now, the fact that it changes our brain, in terms of connectivity, may be interesting, maybe from an academic point of view. But what we really want to know is whether bilingualism changes behavior. Does it change the way we behave? Does it change the way we think? And this is where we're going in my presentation. So what research shows, for example, for young children, remember the prejudice that young children may be confused if they are exposed to more than one language. Actually, research shows exactly the opposite. It shows, for example, that even a newborn can be very sensitive to the difference between the two languages. If there were more than one languages in the environment, in the last 3 months of pregnancy, when an unborn baby can actually hear a fair amount of what goes on in the environment, that baby comes to the world with a special sensitivity to those two languages that were spoken in the environment. If we look at, 3 or 4 month old babies, so a little bit later, these babies can tell the difference between languages that have the same rhythm. So this is a very young infant, long before they start speaking, but they have this sensitivity. They can distinguish between two languages that have very similar rhythms. And older, slightly older infants at 8 months can actually, this is really fantastic, they can distinguish two languages just by, without even listening to them, just by looking at silent talking faces. So just by looking at the movements of the mouth and the facial expressions that go with speaking one language or speaking another language. So these bilingual infants can tell the difference just by looking at silent talking faces using different languages. So quite far from the idea of confusion. Now, the effects on language. So I'm a linguist by training, so this is very interesting, how bilingualism can make people better in linguistic terms. So many parents worry about mixing, oh, my child is mixing languages. Does it mean they're confused? Actually, mixing has a grammar. Mixing follows particular rules. Mixing shows very good competence in both languages. So it's not just random putting together words and bits from one language and the other. Actually, it shows very good competence in both languages. And being bilingual gives a child a better spontaneous understanding of how language works. So not just in terms of rules, you know, young children don't know what to do with grammar rules, but because their brain constantly compares the two languages, they have a better understanding of how languages can vary and how languages work in general, in a spontaneous way. That gives them a head start in early literacy. When they start reading, for example, being bilingual has been shown to give an inroad into early literacy, both of alphabetic systems, so languages like English and Italian that use an alphabetic system, but also non-alphabetic systems like Chinese, for example. And that is very useful indeed. And also better ability to learn other languages. Having two languages makes you better at learning a third language or a fourth language. Now, outside language, there are very interesting effects of bilingualism. One of the most interesting one is this. A bilingual child understands at an earlier age than a monolingual child that it is possible to have a different point of view, a different perspective from your own. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the fact that bilingual children understand very early on that not everybody is bilingual, or not everybody is bilingual in the languages that they speak. And so they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to. And that means they have to step out of their so-called linguistic shoes and appreciate that other people have a different kind of linguistic competence. And this is extended outside language and leads to better empathy, better understanding that it is possible to have a different perspective, a different point of view from your own. And bilingual adults are also better able to switch from their own egocentric perspective and to embracing other people's points of view and other people's perspectives. This is hard to underestimate, you know, how important this is from the point of view of multiculturalism and civil life and living together in our types of societies. And there are other effects that have been found on attention, the way we pay attention, so-called cognitive control. So that means more efficient control of attention, paying attention to what matters, no matter what we're doing, and disregarding or being less distracted by what doesn't matter. So the ability to handle conflicting information. Just to give you a very well-known example, if I ask you to read those words, this is called the Stroop task. Some of you may know it, is widely used in cognitive research. So this is the easy condition. If I ask you to read those words fast, you know, just read what they say, it's not difficult. Blue, yellow, red, purple, black, no problem. Here comes the interesting condition. Now, if you have to read the color of the ink in which the words are written as fast as you can see that this is more difficult, because you have to say yellow, but the word says blue. You have to say red, but the word says yellow. You have to say blue, but the word says red. So you have to, there is a clash between what the color that you have to name and what the words actually say. And you can't help reading, you know, if you can read, you can't help reading those words. So bilinguals do better at this task. So they're slowed down in the second condition, but not as much as monolinguals. So they can handle conflicting information in a more efficient way. Now, what about adult bilingualism? So late bilingualism, adult second language learning. One of the most common myths is that you need to be a child to learn a language well. So how can you learn a new language well after a certain age? Can you reach a very high level of proficiency? And more myths about second language learning. How can you learn a second language if you're an adult? Well, you go to a classroom, you have a teacher, you learn the rules. So the teacher shows you how the grammatical rules work. And if you make a mistake, they correct you. So those are the ways in which you learn a second language. Also, if you're an adult learner, you have a first language, at least one, and that language obviously affects the second language. So you make mistakes that are due to the fact that you know the first language. So the direction of the confusion goes from first language to second language, but not the other way around. Now, what does research show? It shows a very different picture. It shows, for example, that adults can reach very high levels of proficiency. They can become native-like. Even if they keep an accent, they can become extremely fluent, extremely idiomatic, extremely efficient in communication in the second language. And they may not have enough time to reach those levels, or they may not have enough motivation to reach those levels because time is limited. You know, unlike children who have plenty of time, they're fully immersed in the language, they don't have a family or a job to worry about. Many adults juggle different things in their everyday life, and so they may have a limited time to devote to a second language, but they can reach very high levels. And what they know when they reach these very high levels is implicit. So what they know explicitly in terms of rules is only the tip of the iceberg. Also, we know that when you learn a second language, your native language also changes. It doesn't mean that you lose it, but it means that the effects go in both ways. So a bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals, and we'll come back to this. So there are effects that are normally called attrition, but there are normal effects of learning other languages on your native language. So you're not the same as a person who knows only one language when you learn other languages. And we know that the cognitive effects that we were talking about before are found across the lifespan. So they're found in young adults who learn a foreign language at university, for example, and we've done studies on this. We've also found effects in much older learners. And I just want to mention a study that we did on the beautiful island of Skye. This is northern Scotland, where they run intensive courses in Gaelic. Gaelic is the minority language spoken in the northwest of Scotland, and we'll come back to this. But the point of this study is that we had a range of ages from 18 to 78. So very much older people, people in their retirement age. And we looked at the cognitive effects, and we found that we measured everybody before the course and after the course. The course was 1 week of very intensive Gaelic. And what we found was that everybody improved from before to after the course, but the people in their 70s were the ones who improved the most. So the biggest difference was found in that age range, which means that people respond very well to the cognitive challenge of learning a new language. Now, and we know from research is that multilingualism over the lifespan acts as a cognitive reserve that can delay some normal effects of aging, so normal it's like memory loss or ability to pay attention. So being bilingual can compensate for that. And in some cases of pathological aging, so certain kinds of dementia, for example, the first symptoms appear 4 or 5 years later compared to monolingual speakers. So it doesn't mean that you don't get dementia, but it means that the effects are delayed by 4 or 5 years. There are new myths arising out of this research. So one is, oh, of course, bilingual children are more intelligent, right? And this is the opposite of what we were talking about at the beginning. So bilingual children are confused? No, they're not confused. Are bilingual children geniuses? Of course not. We're not talking about more intelligence. We're talking about an extra gear that allows both children and adults to do better in a range of circumstances. And of course, you know, as I've already mentioned, we get this question quite often: is it true that if you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's? And the answer is, of course, it's not true. What we were talking about is just a delay in the appearance of the first symptoms. And just to make ourselves laugh, there's also science fiction appearing more and more often. So publicities like this, you know, and again, you know, we are allowed to laugh now because these are people wanting to sell bilingualism and language learning and methods to learn languages on these grounds, which are laughable. Now, why these effects? These effects are due, and one of the main reasons is that when you're bilingual, the two languages of bilingual, so the three, if there is more than two, are always active. So you can't switch them off in the morning and keep only the language that you're needing. So when you speak one language, you have to exclude the others. So I'm speaking English to you, but my Italian, that's me, is very much there, and I'm pushing it away. My brain is working so that Italian doesn't affect my English so much. And that constant experience of choosing one language and excluding the other or others is what is extended outside the language domain and makes people better at handling conflicting information and monitoring conflicting information. And I'm not saying anything about people who use a sign language. I mean, this would be a different chapter, because so-called bimodal bilinguals who speak a spoken language and use a sign language, in which case there is no conflict between modalities. Both modalities can be produced at the same time. So that's a slightly different situation. But for everybody who knows more than one spoken language, this is the case. And that leads us to our main point. It doesn't matter which languages. So from a cognitive and linguistic point of view, what matters is the fact of having more than one language in the brain, not whether these languages are prestigious, not whether these languages are economically valuable. So there are no useful or useless languages from this point of view. All languages are good. We have to say, you know, we have to wonder whether these effects that I was talking about are always found. They're not always found because many factors play a role. Bilingualism is not a black or white dimension. It's not that you're either bilingual or you're not. It's a multi-dimensional continuum affected by many different factors. For example, if we're talking about bilingualism in the family is a commitment and presents many challenges too. So a bilingual child needs, for example, to hear enough of both languages. So it's not enough to have mommy who speaks one language and daddy who speaks another language if the child is not exposed to both languages. And that requires some planning and some organization and creating an environment in which both languages are heard and engage the child. Hearing the language from more than one person is important. So hearing, if not a community, a mini community of people who speak in different ways, because what we call normal variation is very important from the point of view of learning what is possible and what is not possible in the language, and also from the point of view of valuing the language as something that is not just mommy's language or daddy's language, but is something that is spoken by many people. Literacy matters a lot, and we'll see in a minute, you know, the difference between languages that have literacy and languages that don't have literacy, languages that can be taught in schools and languages that can't be taught in schools because they don't have an agreed writing system. And positive attitudes are very important. Children are very sensitive to what people think about their languages and about their being bilingual. They know when people have negative attitudes about certain languages, and we can't blame them for not wanting to speak languages that are not valued and appreciated by the community. So when it comes to minority languages introduced by migration, should people maintain their home languages? Of course, they should maintain their home languages. And we deal with migrant families all the time. Migrant families who often experience the pressure not to speak their home language, to abandon their home language so that they help their child to integrate linguistically and socially. But we know that having another language is not an obstacle for successfully learning the language of the community. And maintaining a home language is an advantage from the point of view of family communication. Of course, you know, there's a much richer family communication in the home language than in a language that everybody in the family is in the process of learning. And of course, maintaining the home language gives the child the potential benefits of bilingualism. And we know that in many societies, including the one where I live, there is a tendency to treat migrant children as a problem to solve. So there is a tendency to pathologize and problematize issues related to migration and second language learning. So we have a problem to solve. How can we solve it? How about looking at these children as a resource, as something that can enrich our society, our monolingual societies? We know that unfortunately, there's also a monolingual and monocultural bias in the educational and diagnostic tools that we use in schools, in medical practices. We use tools that are typically developed on the basis of monolingual norms. So basically, the fiction is that we expect a bilingual to behave like two monolinguals in one, which is not what a bilingual is, as I said before. So we should ideally test children in all their languages if that it was feasible. In many cases it's not feasible, but we should at least know that we're not doing bilingual children a favor if we measure their abilities on the basis of monolingual norms. And we know from research that there are positive effects of multilingual classrooms. So this is something that really people should know. We did a study in Scotland where we wanted to look at the social and linguistic integration in multilingual classrooms. And we had everybody learning the same language that nobody knew. So we had monolingual children and multilingual children learning Spanish as an L2. Nobody knew Spanish in Scotland, in Scottish classrooms. And we had classrooms that varied with respect to how many multilingual children there were. So there were more multilingual classrooms and less multilingual classrooms, but everybody had to learn the same language. And it doesn't scroll.
Does it work if you click with your mouse? Oh, there you go.
Yes. Yes, this is, how can I get rid of this? Okay. So what we did at the end, we gave them cognitive tests and linguistic tests to both monolingual and multilingual children. And what we found was very interesting. We found that with respect to Spanish and with respect to the cognitive test, the bilingual, the multilingual children had an advantage, even if many of them were still learning English as the majority language. But the most interesting thing is that the monolingual Scottish children who were in more multilingual classrooms tended to perform better in both the linguistic and the cognitive tests. So being exposed to a multilingual environment was positive for the monolingual Scottish children as well. And this is a similar effect that was found in a very recent study done in the United States about the effects of multilingual societies, and particularly the effects of being passively exposed to other languages in multilingual societies. So this was a study where monolingual Americans in Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, were compared to monolingual Americans in California. Now, I don't need to tell you that the main difference is that California is a much more multilingual society than central Pennsylvania. And everybody, these monolinguals, had to learn Finnish as a foreign language, which is a challenging language in many respects, and their brain reactions were measured. And what was found was that the monolinguals in California who had been exposed passively to many languages actually had an advantage in terms of brain reactions compared to the monolinguals in Pennsylvania. So it sounds like their brain, just by virtue of being passively exposed to other languages in a multilingual society, was better prepared to learn another language, which is very interesting indeed, because it really shows that even passive exposure can matter. Now, I'm going to turn to minority languages, and particularly indigenous minority languages, languages that are at the risk of disappearing. So many languages are dying every day in the world. Languages that are not transmitted to the next generation, so languages that are not learned by children in the next generation, are bound to die. So many of these languages survive in a situation of bilingualism with a majority language. And so bilingualism is vital for this intergenerational transmission across generations, but also speaking the minority language, because of everything I said so far, can give children the benefits of bilingualism. So there is a bidirectional relationship between minority languages and bilingualism. And we can look at some research, and the two languages that I'm going to tell you something about are very close to my heart, because one is Sardinian, which is the language that my mother spoke. My mother was born in Sardinia and raised in Sardinia, and she spoke Sardinian, but not with me, because she thought that Sardinian wasn't a very useful language, and everything that I said applies to my case, and she thought that I had to learn English rather than Sardinian. So we did a study on Sardinian children, both younger and older, and we compared bilingual Italian Sardinian children with Italian monolingual children from the same socioeconomic backgrounds, and we gave them many cognitive and linguistic tests. Remember that the prejudice in Sardinia is that a child who speaks Sardinian can't speak Italian well. So the idea that, Italian is prestigious, you have to speak Italian well. If you know Sardinian, you don't speak Italian well. So we were interested in measuring how these children performed in Italian, in an Italian comprehension test of complex constructions. And what we found was that in the cognitive tests, no difference among the young children, bilingual and monolingual, but the older bilingual children performed better than the older monolingual children. And for the Italian task, in the vast majority of cases, no differences between monolingual and bilingual children. So it's simply not true that Italian is spoiled by knowledge of Sardinian, except for two complex structures where bilinguals actually do better than monolinguals. But in the vast majority of cases, there is no difference. So this prejudice is simply not true. We also measured Sardinian adults, and we had adults both at lower education levels and higher education levels, again, both linguistic and cognitive tests. And what we found was that for higher education, bilingual and monolinguals, no difference. So again, no evidence that being bilingual has a damaging effect, but at lower education levels, bilinguals actually perform better than monolinguals for some language structures. And so it sounds like bilingualism partly compensates for the limitations of lower education in these speakers. Now, what about Gaelic? Scottish Gaelic is a Celtic language spoken in the northwest part of Scotland. It's a language in decline, as all minority languages. Fewer and fewer people are speaking it. But one big difference is that there are schools where everything is taught in Gaelic. So Gaelic medium education means all instruction is given in Gaelic. And no, I mean, there are some schools that operate this way. And so we did a study where we looked at bilingual children in Gaelic medium education, and we compared them with children in English medium education from the same similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, we gave both linguistic and cognitive tests, and we found that in most cases, there is no difference. Again, this is interesting because it means that bilingualism doesn't have any damaging effect, but in one of the tests, 1 out of 3, the bilinguals have an advantage. So where there is a difference, the difference is in favor of the bilinguals, but otherwise there is no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. We also looked at new speakers of Gaelic compared to home speakers of Gaelic. So many people, many pupils, students who go to these Gaelic medium education schools don't come from Gaelic speaking families. And so they learn Gaelic from school, but they don't speak it at home, as opposed to students who come from Gaelic speaking homes and go to Gaelic medium education. So we wanted to compare home and new speakers of Gaelic, and we gave them again English tests and cognitive tests, and we found again very, Gaelic, new speakers of Gaelic perform very highly indeed in all English language test and the cognitive test. We also tested attitudes in these young people, so towards Gaelic. Obviously, they like speaking Gaelic, no problem about speaking Gaelic that they learned at school. However, English is considered more cool. So everything that matters in their young lives is done in English and not in Gaelic, which raises some interesting problems because, these are the people who we hope, the government hopes that they're going to speak Gaelic to their children. But will they actually speak Gaelic to their children if they, like Gaelic, but they prefer to do things in English? So positive attitudes matter, and we have more research on this. So we compared, really, we asked children what they thought about their being bilingual, both in migrant families, so languages introduced by migration, and in Gaelic, so minority languages, indigenous minority languages. And we found that children with positive attitudes, children who came from encouraging schools, encouraging families, family environments, are more likely to show the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. So again, attitudes matter. We have to create a positive environment for bilingualism. Just exposing them to languages that are not appreciated or valued by the world around them is not enough. We have to create and encourage positive attitudes. And finally, there was a study comparing the two kinds of bilingualism that I've just mentioned, Gaelic English and Sardinian Italian, and children in both these minority environments, again, cognitive and linguistic tasks, and bilingual children did better than monolingual children in both environments, but Gaelic English bilingual children did better than Sardinian Italian bilingual children. Why? Well, probably because of Gaelic medium education. There's no Sardinian medium education. In fact, there is no accepted literacy in Sardinian because there's no accepted written system that satisfies everybody, whereas there is one for Gaelic. So literacy really, really matters and can help preserving and keeping minority languages alive. So a connection, we often find that language policies, even well-meaning language policies and intervention for minority languages are often disconnected from communities. And we think that these connections are really essential for intergenerational transmission. We need to connect with communities. And we need, from our point of view, investing in languages means providing people with the tools to understand their bilingualism and their situation, providing them with accessible information, providing information to families, learners, teachers, policymakers about the benefits, about the challenges, about the facts of bilingualism, because that leads to better decisions. And this is what we do through my center, Bilingualism Matters. This is precisely what our aim is, what our mission is, to bring research to people so that people can make informed decisions wherever they are and whichever their languages are. Because, and I'm really finishing now, investing in languages is important. Investing in every language of the world is important. Thank you very much.
Antonella, thank you so much for this very, very informative presentation. So to continue our program, I have two colleagues, Carlo Ladd and Zara Mustamand, who are our interns at UNA New York, who will continue with the questions. We have lots of questions. They have been going through the questions as they come in, and hopefully we can answer all of them for you. So Carlo, I'll hand it over to you. You can start.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Professor Sorace. We have lots of questions coming in. So if you have any questions, just drop them into the Q&A that you can find at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can. We might run a little late because we have so many. But thank you for those who have sent in questions. So we'll start with a question from Georgina. Georgina asks, if you don't speak a second language fluently, should you still speak it to your child while they're acquiring their first language?
Okay, very interesting question. We get that question quite often, more and more often, in fact. I would say that what matters is communicating with your child, right? I mean, you want to, being able to communicate everything and smoothly to your child. If you can do that in a language that is not your own, why not? You shouldn't be afraid that your child learns your mistakes, your mispronunciation, and so on. Particularly if your child can hear the language not just from you, but from other people. I said that before. Hearing different people speaking in different ways gives a child really the way to regularize across speakers. So children don't automatically learn, the characteristics of this speaker or that speaker. So yes, there are more and more people speaking a non-native language. If they feel comfortable doing that, it's a great present for your children.
Thank you so much for those insights, Dr. Sorace. We have another question from Francesco. He asks, Dr. Sorace, talking about biliteracy, what is the situation of dual language immersion programs at school level in the UK? Are there certain languages privileged over others in this sense?
Certainly there are, yes, there are dual immersion programs, not as many as in the United States. Dual immersion programs are much more common in North America than in Europe, but definitely there are programs, that, yes, there are some languages that are preferred in this respect. So French, there are French dual immersion programs. There are some new Chinese dual immersion programs, and a few other languages. Do they work? Yes, they do work very well. There is some research done on how children do academically in these programs, and the short answer is they do very well, and they do linguistically very well, because obviously being exposed to both languages helps their learning and speaking both languages.
Thank you very much. So we have another question here from Ruth, who says, I work as a speech and language therapist. How would you encourage families to use their minority home language? Are there good resources you would point them towards?
Thank you very much for that question. With Bilingualism Matters, we deal with health professionals quite a lot. And speech and language therapists are obviously health professionals who are often at the receiving end. So they get referrals by doctors, for example, and families who worry that their bilingual child is lying behind in terms of attainment, or teachers who worry about students who don't seem to be doing very well. And so very often these professionals get referrals on the ground that they may be a speech and language impairment. Now, we do a lot of work with these professionals to make sure that they get trained on bilingualism when they train for the profession, but also during their regular updates in the profession, because very often they don't know enough about bilingualism. And so they have to make professional decisions in deciding when, you know, a child's mistakes are a sign of a language impairment, which can happen both in bilingual and monolingual children, or a normal stage in learning another language. If they don't know enough about how children learn languages, it might be difficult to make that decision. So are there resources? There are more and more resources. There are also resources that we are creating. There aren't enough resources, I would say. There's more work that needs to be done. But I think we should really act at the level of training for these professions so that people start the profession with the right tools to be able to deal with bilingual children.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sorace. A question from Ismini. What is the best way for an older adult to start learning a second language?
It depends on what you mean by older adults. What's the best way? As I said, the differences between children and adults are often overemphasized, right? People say, oh, children can become completely fluent, whereas adults can't. One of the factors that might play a role, as I said, is the availability of time. Adults have a busy life compared to children who have a less busy life, right? And so adults have, motivation to learn only a language for particular purposes, or maybe learn only to read a language rather than speak it, and so on. So there are differences there. What's the best age? I would say any age is good. Clearly, the more time you can devote to the language, the better. So I would say that for older adults, you know, the adults that I mentioned before, people in their retirement age who have more time because they are retired, learning a new language can be a fantastic way of using their retirement years, because as we have evidence that their brain responds very well to the challenge of learning a new language. But it's also possible for, you know, younger adults who are busy with their lives to find some time, you know, to learn a language. Clearly, you know, they have to be realistic about what can be achieved, but given what we know about learning languages at any age, it's always a good idea to learn a language regardless of age.
Thank you very much. So we have another question from Alvaro here. If you speak 3 languages, is it a good idea to use 3 of them at the same time with kids, or rather use 1 on each stage of the child?
Okay, this is again a more common question. It's becoming more and more common because there are more and more trilingual or multilingual people. In our experience, what we see is that children often appreciate consistency of use of a language with a particular parent. So, but clearly what works in one family doesn't automatically work in all families. So there may be families in which a parent who switches among different languages, that's fine. What we see in many families is that it's better in general if a parent sticks to one language. So this is the method, you know, for bilingual families, usually called one parent, one language. And particularly for the parent who speaks a minority language, it would be useful to stick to the same language, because the majority language, the child can get it from outside the family, from the outside world, but very often, you know, the input in the minority language it is really important that the parent is consistent in using the minority language. As I said, there is no one size fits all method that works in all families, but I think that probably consistency pays off.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sorace. We have a question from Karen. She asks, please define worst language skills as mentioned in the reference to the UK. What goes into determining this?
It means fewer people able to use any language, even at a lower level. The problem with what I call privileged monolingualism is that people don't have much of a motivation to learn other languages. So people think, well, everybody speaks English, right? So why should we waste time to learn another language? Typically, they don't know anything about the benefits of knowing other languages. They just see, the instrumental value, and they think, well, I can travel, and I can use English, and people can understand me. Now, it's not even true that everybody speaks English, but it's clearly true that English is a widespread language. But it's unfortunate that that means that people don't have much of a motivation, and they think that for example, in a school curriculum, it's better to invest in useful subjects like science, for example, rather than languages. What we know from research, not just our own, but research in general, is that having languages, studying languages, actually benefits the whole curriculum, not just languages per se, or not just humanities, if you want, but also scientific subjects. So investing in languages in schools is also good from for all subjects. So I think we have to educate people. We have to provide them with enough information why learning other languages is good, regardless of the immediate usefulness of speaking languages.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Daniela. Can you clarify if there is any difference at all between the concept of bilingualism and multilingualism, and what factors affect pronunciation, especially with late bilingualism?
Right, two very important questions. As I said, usually bilingualism means two, right? Bilingual, and multilingual means more than two. We use the term bilingual in a broad sense, as I said at the beginning, to mean more than one. So, we don't make a principal distinction between bilingual and monolingual and trilingual, for example. Now, does it matter from the point of view of the effects that I was talking about, whether you know 3 languages as opposed to 2? The short answer is that it doesn't seem to matter for the time being, although we need more research. We need more research no matter what about all the topics that I touched on during my presentation. But so far, it seems that the real difference is between knowing only one language and knowing more than one. So 2 or 3 or 4. What was your last question again? The last part of the question?
The last part of the question was, what factors affect pronunciation, especially with late bilingualism?
Right. So pronunciation is one of the characteristics of late bilinguals. So if you learn a language later in life, you're more likely to keep an accent. And I'm a good example, right? So why do people keep an accent? There are different factors. One is that learning to articulate, to have a native-like pronunciation implies not only cognitive factors, but also motor, articulatory factors. So you have to retrain yourself to position your articulatory organs to pronounce sounds of a second or a third language in particular ways. So it's a combination of cognitive and motor articulatory factors that is not always easy for the majority of people. There's also the fact that speaking with a particular accent is very much related to I don't know, identity and so on. So I've come across learners, second language speakers who could pronounce words in a native-like way, but they didn't feel comfortable doing that because they felt they were kind of acting. They were not themselves in pronouncing words in that particular way. So, and we also have to bear in mind, what is a native-like pronunciation? What is the target that we are aspiring? There are many different kinds of pronunciations, like there are many different kinds of languages, and some pronunciations tend to be more prestigious than others. When I studied English, the so-called received pronunciation of British English was the target. Now it's not anymore. Now, you know, American English is regarded as an acceptable target, and that's what people aim at. So I think we shouldn't really overemphasize, you know, the importance of speaking with, you know, a particular kind of target pronunciation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sorace. We have time for 2 more questions, including the one that I will be asking from Carrie. Carrie asks, Dr. Sorace, can you further address the misconception that learning a few languages at once does not confuse one in school? She says, speaking from personal experience, I felt very confused in school while I was learning how to read and write in 3 languages at once. She said, I was learning English, I was learning Arabic and Farsi at home.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. Again, we have to remember that not all learners are the same, right? So what I was telling you about are generalizations, obviously, over a number of cases, a number of learners, a number of speakers, and so on. Whether a child feels confused or not, it depends on many different factors, where, you know, the languages, you know, the general environment, how the languages are taught, as I mentioned, you know, attitudes and so on. Whether it's a good idea to learn literacy simultaneously in different languages. And this is a controversial area, actually, because there are people who would say, well, you know, learning to speak and hear and understand spoken languages at the same time is one thing, but learning to read and write simultaneously in different languages is a slightly different thing. And so some people would say it's better to acquire, learning to read in different languages simultaneously is not so much a problem. Complete literacy, meaning learning to read and write in both languages, is a different matter. And it might be, some people would say it's better to stage, you know, full literacy and acquire it in one language first and then later on in others. But we need more research about this, and we need more research about, you know, what this means in different kinds of environments and in different kinds of schools. But thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have one more question, and if anybody did not have their question answered, we have limited time, unfortunately. You can email Dr. Sorace and she'll gladly answer you by email. So please do ask those. So our last question from Iwan, the point made about children in Gaelic medium education seeing English as the cool language is common elsewhere as well. Are there any examples of minority languages which have succeeded in becoming as cool or as prestigious as the majority language?
Thank you for the question. Very interesting. I don't think I have enough knowledge about what is done in very different minority languages to be able to answer. Among the ones that I know best, it seems that the general problem is the lack of resources, you know, in these minority languages. So resources that matter to young people, resources that matter to not only to children, but also to teenagers, for example. It's quite clear that, you know, there's more and more, for example, books and games and video games and for younger children, but perhaps not so much for older children and teenagers and so on. So that's what I think we need to invest more thoughts and more resources. So making the language more a part of young people's lives is what would motivate them to use it among themselves as well, because this is what we notice in Gaelic medium education, for example. In the classroom, yes, people use Gaelic with one another. Outside the classroom, they prefer to use English because English is, what is really, matters more in their lives. So I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to make the language more real for young people, especially if we hope, as the Scottish government hopes, and as we hope as well, that new speakers of Gaelic will be inclined to pass on the language to the next generation, to their own children, because this is what really matters, as I said. It matters that the language is passed on from one generation to the next. And if we can help that in any way we can guarantee the survival of minority languages.
Okay, Dr. Sorace, thank you so much for this very informative and fascinating program. We've gone a little over our time, but we had so many questions from the audience. I hope everyone enjoyed it like as much as I did. And I wish I had known you when my children were younger, because I would have certainly taught them my first language, which is Hungarian, but I didn't do such a good job with that. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, they can find you with any of the questions that we haven't had time to cover. You can visit the website Bilingualism Matters, and it's on the screen at the moment. And if you wanted to become a member of our organization, which I hope some of you would consider, because we have these amazing programs throughout the year, we are at unanyc.org, and membership in our organization is open to everyone. So we would love to have you become a member, and it's not expensive. It's really only $25 a year the first year, and $50 after that. So anyway, we'd love to have you. So I think we are finished for the day. You can follow us on all this social media. Thank you to our interns, Carlo and Zara, who've created everything and continue to do a wonderful job. And I invite you back for our next program, which is going to be in a couple of weeks. I'll be working on it right now. I don't have the date yet. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.